A Romance to Remember. Sapphire Bay Romance, Book 4. Written by Sandra Edwards. Narrated by Heather Masters. Chapter 1. Marla Taylor had missed her calling. She should have been a matchmaker. That's what she'd thought when she looked into the eyes of Rosalie Fairbanks that morning. There was something lonely residing in the old woman's weary gaze. Even though she had come to Sapphire Bay Resort with her granddaughter, Rosalie was as alone as a person could be. The best thing for her, Marla thought, was a little vacation romance, and Marla knew just the candidate to provide that. She'd seen the same look in the eyes of another of the resort's guests yesterday. Nick Finley was at Sapphire Bay with his grandson, oddly enough. They'd arrived just before dinner last night. Marla had decided there was something serendipitous about two lonely souls coming to the island with their grandchildren at the same time. The elder Mr. Finley, who was 75 if he was a day, looked a little pale and had moved slowly, which made Marla wonder if he was actually lonely or just tired. But when she met Rosalie, she knew it was loneliness on both their parts. Marla would have to see what she could do about arranging an impromptu meeting between Rosalie and Nick. And perhaps Rosalie's granddaughter and Nick's grandson were single too. The only thing better than a vacation romance was a double vacation romance. Mother? Donnie, Marla's son and the owner of Sapphire Bay, said from beside her, startling her. What are you up to? Nothing. She glanced up at him. He had that suspicious look in his eyes. You're paranoid. With good reason, he chuckled. Remember, he said, pointing a finger at her as he backed away. You are not the hotel's resident matchmaker. Marla crossed her arms. Well, she said softly, perhaps I should be. Rose Fairbanks leaned against the lanai railing of the 15th floor suite she was sharing with her grandmother at Sapphire Bay Resort. Rose had never been to Hawaii, but her grandmother, Rosalie Collier Fairbanks, had been there once before, many years ago, long before she ever met Rose's late grandfather, Tim. Grandma, Rose said, I can see why you wanted to come back here. This place is beautiful. It's so grown up, Rosalie said. I barely recognize it. This side of the island seems very secluded. Are you sure you don't want to stay in Waikiki? Rose asked, feeling there was way too much hope in her tone. Where the action is? Rosalie shook her head. No. A soft smile touched her lips. I spent a lot of time on this side of the island when I was here, right where this hotel sits. She drew in a breath, keeping her eyes on the ocean. No, she said softly. This is where I want to stay. Was there another hotel here? Rose asked. No, just a beach. The beach? Rose stopped and looked at her grandmother. But you don't swim. No, I don't, Rosalie said, with a hint of mischief wrapped around her words. There was a story behind this trip. Rose was sure of it. Before it was over, she'd find out what it was. Rose suspected that her grandmother was reminiscing about whatever had drawn her back here in the first place. The quieter and more evasive she got, the more curious Rose became. Grandma, Rose said. You haven't been very specific about what you want to do while we're here. Nothing, Rosalie replied. I don't want to do anything, except perhaps take a walk or two along the beach. She sucked in a breath and looked at Rose with tired brown eyes. I'll be just fine right here. You should go explore the island. Have fun. She nodded. By myself? Exploring on your own is when the most extraordinary things happen. Okay, that was it. Something had gone on here with her grandmother, and Rose wanted to know what. What happened when you were here before? It's a little hazy, Rosalie said. But if I sit here and look out there long enough, she pointed toward the water, it'll come back to me. She said it like she really believed it, but Rose knew her grandmother was purposefully being evasive. Rose was starting to think it had something to do with a man, one who wasn't her grandfather. Chapter 2. As Nick Finley held onto the railing of the 14th floor lanai, he could look down at the beach and still see her frolicking in the surf, just as she'd done 50 years ago. Oh, sure, the landscape had changed since then, but Nick wasn't seeing the current state of the cove. Nick was replaying a memory. He'd met her while he was stationed at Wheeler. She had come to Hawaii with her friends on a college graduation trip. They'd met at the Hula Lounge, a hip, for the time, bar not far from where the Sapphire Bay Resort now stood. Nick's time-worn memories of that night swirled in his thoughts. It had happened long ago, but he remembered it like it was yesterday. Sam Cooke was playing on the jukebox, and the Hula Lounge was crowded that night. But she and her friends, 2 other girls, had managed to grab a table. Nick himself had nabbed a stool at the bar. Her back was to him when he first noticed her. Although he couldn't see her face, her long, wavy, strawberry blonde hair caught his eye and had him thinking thoughts he shouldn't be thinking about a woman he didn't know. He wanted to see her face, to know if it was as pretty and inviting as her hair. He half hoped she'd get up to dance with one of the fellas who kept approaching her. They were practically lined up, but each time she declined with a shake of her head. This made Nick think twice about asking her to dance. Even so, he'd sure like to get a look at her face. Both her friends were pretty girls, one blonde, the other brunette. And even though he could see their faces, something made him want to hold out to see what she looked like. As Nick nursed his beer, she stood. She chatted with her friends for a moment before turning around. He gazed upon her angelic face as she headed to the other side of the bar. She was undoubtedly the most beautiful woman he'd ever laid eyes on. She stepped up to the bar, where the bartender went to her immediately. She spoke to the barkeep. Nick assumed to order drinks. While her drinks were being made, her gaze traveled around the bar until her eyes met his. Brown eyes. Large brown eyes caught him, and he could not, nor did he want to, pull his gaze away. The bartender set 3 glasses in front of her, stealing her attention away. She paid the man, then gathered the glasses in a triangle between her hands. Before she stepped away from the bar, she glanced back at Nick and smiled. She pulled her gaze away shyly before turning away and heading back to her friends. Nick had fallen head over heels for her at that very instant. And now, all these years later, he'd come back at the risk of alienating his entire family. How could he tell them that before he died, he had to return to the site where he'd found and lost his one true love? Grandfather? Nicholas, his grandson, called to him softly. Nick dragged his gaze away from the beach and forced it over to Nicholas. Beautiful place, isn't it? Nicholas nodded. Grandfather, why are we here? You didn't have to come, Nick reminded him. Nicholas gave him a wry look. They both knew that wasn't true. Craig Finley, Nicholas's father and Nick's son, had insisted upon it. Craig's wife, Janet, had suggested they come with Nick. She wouldn't have minded a trip to Hawaii, but Craig was too busy. It was just as well. Nick didn't want Craig and Janet with him anyway. Truth be told, he didn't want Nicholas here either. But if it had to be someone, he supposed Nicholas, his namesake, was the logical choice. It wasn't that Nick didn't love his children and grandchildren. He did. But he knew they wouldn't understand his desire to come to Hawaii when they found out why. The day after tomorrow would be the 50th anniversary of the day he met the love of his life, who was not Alma, his late wife of 45 years. Whatever's going on with you, Nicholas said, I wish you'd tell me. Nick moved to a chair on the lanai and took a seat. He looked up at Nicholas and said, There's nothing going on. I just wanted to come to Hawaii. Why does that have to mean something's going on? Did you and Grandma ever come here? Nick shook his head. This was their spot. Bringing Alma here wouldn't have been right. Nick smiled at the thought of his wife. She'd known he was in love with another woman when they met. Nick had gotten Alma pregnant, though, so he'd done the honorable thing and married her. They'd had a good marriage, 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl, 5 grandchildren. He supposed they'd have great-grandchildren sooner rather than later. All but one of the grandkids were in their 20s. Nick looked at his grandson. You know what I think you need? What's that? Nicholas asked. A woman. You have someone in mind? He asked with a grin. No, I think you can handle that all on your own. You take after me. That's what Grandma used to say. Nicholas's soft, sad chuckle filled the air. Yes, Alma had said that from the time Nicholas reached manhood. He looked just like his grandfather. And Nick supposed he did. Rosalie stepped out onto the lanai and closed the sliding glass door. The suite's balcony was comfortable, which meant a lot to Rosalie's aging body these days. Plus, it offered a bird's-eye view of the beach beneath her. She found something comforting in the ability to gaze down at the beach and let her thoughts take her back to another time and place. She'd been hoping the hula lounge would still be around and had been a little disappointed to learn that it, although not the building, had been sacrificed in favor of a restaurant decades ago. Maybe she and Rose could go there for lunch while they were here. It wouldn't be the same, but at least she could revisit the very spot where she'd shared her first dance with him. Hey, Grandma. Rose came out onto the lanai. What are you doing? Admiring the view. Has it changed that much since you were here? Oh, yes. Rosalie sighed. This hotel was not here. There was nothing here except that beach down there. She recognized the gigantic rocks that they'd climbed over to get to the secluded shoreline where— "Did you meet a boy here, Grandma?" "He was not a boy. He was very much a man." "What?" Rose screeched. "Grandma, you had a September romance here in Hawaii?" Rosalie looked at her granddaughter. "What's a September romance?" "It's where you meet someone and fall madly in love, but for whatever reason, it doesn't work out." She shrugged. "But you never forget them." "Are you talking from experience?" Rosalie asked. It wouldn't hurt to throw the focus off herself. Rose shook her head and slowly turned to look at Rosalie. "Nah," she said softly. "But someday I'd like to meet someone who means that much to me." She smiled and nudged Rosalie's arm. "I'd kind of like it to work out, though." They both laughed. Rosalie would love to tell Rose about him. Every year at this time, she played it over in her head. Every inch of the 8-day adventure. Finally saying the words out loud might make it real again, somehow. By now, it seemed more like a movie Rosalie had seen once, and she longed to speak the words out loud in hopes that it might infuse life back into the perfect dream she'd once shared with the love of her life, if only for a little while. Chapter 3. Rose Fairbanks was certain that her grandmother had a story to tell, one that, deep down inside, she wanted to share. All Rose had to do was coax it out of her. She knew her grandmother was trying to dodge a bullet when she suggested they take a drive and go for lunch. Rose would accommodate her, for now. But sooner rather than later, Rose was going to unearth the secret her grandmother was keeping. Down in the lobby, Marla, the lady who seemed to drift from job to job at the hotel, approached them as they exited the elevator. "Ladies, are we enjoying ourselves?" she asked. "Most definitely," Rose said. "It's absolutely beautiful." "Your first time?" Marla asked. "Mine," Rose nodded. "My grandma's been here before." "Oh, yeah?" Marla looked at Rosalie. "Did you stay here at the hotel?" Rose's grandmother chuckled. "It was many years ago. I'm afraid your hotel wasn't here back then." "Well," Marla touched her arm. "I hope your stay on the island is as memorable as your first." Rosalie's sigh faded into a soft smile. "Tonight there's a fireworks show," Marla said. "You ladies should come up to the tidal wave on the 12th floor, where there's optimum viewing." "Thanks," Rose said, wrapping her arm around Rosalie's. If she didn't drag her grandmother away right now, it looked like Marla would talk the day away. "We just might do that." "Well, you ladies have a wonderful day," Marla said, as if she'd read Rose's mind, then turned away from them. Rose led her grandmother toward the entrance. Half an hour later, Rose and her grandmother were sitting at a table on the deck of the North Shore Grill. Rose glanced around. The restaurant was crowded, but the patrons seemed to be enjoying their meals. "This place looks like it's been here a while," she said. "It has." Rosalie sipped her iced tea. The response drew Rose's gaze back to meet her grandmother's. She studied her through squinted eyes. Same restaurant? Had her grandma dined with him here? Rosalie shook her head. No, this wasn't a restaurant when I was here before. What was it? It was a... Rosalie hesitated. She was either looking for the right word or stalling for time. Either way, Rose grew more curious by the minute. It was a bar. A bar? Rose exclaimed. She got that her grandma had been young herself once, but Rose had never given it much thought. Did you meet him here? Rosalie almost smiled, but then her lips tightened and she shook her head. You really don't want to hear this. Yes, I do. Rosalie adjusted her glasses. You don't want to hear about me and a man who was not your grandfather. Grandma, I'm not naive. I know you were like 30 when you met Grandpa. 28, Rosalie corrected her. Whatever, Rose said. The point is, I seriously doubt you were a virgin when you married Grandpa. I am not having this conversation with you, Rosalie said sternly. Come on, let's get real, Grandma. Rose chastised her. You were in Hawaii, in a bar, where you met some guy. And now that Grandpa's gone, you have obviously come back here to reminisce about this man. Oh, I think you two knew each other really well. I was in Hawaii for 8 days. How well could I have known him? Her grandmother tried to downplay the affair, but Rose wasn't buying it. Pretty well, I think. Which made her wonder. But why now? Why not next month or 6 months ago? Grandpa's been gone for 13 months. Why right now? Rosalie was silent for a long time before she sighed, then said, Because I met him 50 years ago, the day after tomorrow. Really? Here? In this bar? What used to be this bar. What was his name? Rosalie shook her head. You don't really want to know about this? Yes, I do, Grandma, Rose said. Feelings of guilt prickled at her. She shouldn't be so eager to hear about her grandmother's romance with a man who wasn't her grandfather, should she? Even so, Rose urged her to continue. This man was obviously important to you. I want to know about him and the time you spent together. If I tell you this, you have to promise me you won't tell your father. He's very uptight, you know, like his father. He will never understand. Rose chuckled. How right Grandma was. Her father was uptight. It'll be our secret. She gazed at her grandmother until that same soft smile Rose had seen earlier tipped the corners of her mouth again. Then Grandma said, His name was Nick. What was he like? Rose asked, wondering if he was anything like her grandfather. Again, those pangs of guilt stung her. She shouldn't be so enthralled in the story of her grandmother and some guy she knew before Rose's grandfather, one she'd obviously carried in her heart all these years. But the very thought of it fascinated and saddened Rose all at the same time. Rosalie said, He was quiet, pensive, thoughtful. Romantic in a quiet sort of way. As she spoke of him, her eyes sparkled and her smile lit up in a way that Rose had never seen before. Those twinges of guilt jabbed at her again. The description couldn't have been further from Rose's grandfather. Tim Fairbanks was outgoing, had an opinion about everything, and was always the life of the party. He hadn't been the romantic sort, at least not openly, but her grandmother hadn't seemed to mind. Even so, Rose knew her grandfather had loved her grandmother. Okay, so obviously he was not like Grandpa at all. That made Rose wonder if his outer appearance was as different as his inner. What did he look like? Rose didn't know why she was so intrigued by her grandmother's long-gone love affair, and she didn't understand why she wasn't angry about why they were here in Hawaii. She should be, right? At least on her grandfather's behalf. Grandma said, "His eyes were brown." That tidbit supported Rose's suspicions. Grandpa'd had green eyes. Now, if Grandma said this guy had dark hair, that'd be confirmation, since Grandpa's hair, before it turned gray, had been blonde. Grandma went on. He had dark hair. A soft smile tipped the corners of her mouth again. He was tall, with an athletic build. How weird is it that you two just happened to be vacationing here at the same time? Rose asked herself as much as her grandmother. It's like fate. Well then. Grandma's tone had a bite to it. Fate is rather cruel. She stopped, rubbed her forehead above her right eye, then added, But he wasn't vacationing. He was stationed here. Huh? Stationed? He was in the Air Force. A faraway look invaded Grandma's eyes. Rose would bet she was replaying a memory right now. Was it love at first sight? Rose felt kind of weird asking that, but she got the feeling this was something Grandma had been holding in for 50 years, and she really needed to let it out. Grandma nodded. From the moment I first looked into his eyes, I was trapped. Trapped? I couldn't look away, nor did I want to. Grandma was talking, telling the story, but Rose knew she wasn't really with her anymore. Grandma was back there, with him, even if only in her mind's eye. All I could do was look at him, and he was looking right through me. Grandma's smile twitched a little, and she sighed. So, did he come over and introduce himself? Finally, Grandma snapped out of it and looked at Rose. I asked him to dance. What? Rose laughed. You asked him to dance? Get out of town. Back in those days, I wasn't afraid to go after something I wanted. And he'd given me more than one signal that he wouldn't mind being gotten. Rose snorted. Oh my God, Grandma! See, I knew it was wrong to tell you about this. No! Rose shook her head and reached across the table to touch her grandmother's hand. I want to hear it. I want to hear everything. I'm just surprised at how forward you were. Rose wished she'd inherited a little of that from her grandmother. Grandma studied Rose for a moment, then said, Once upon a time, I was a very beautiful woman. The declaration surprised Rose. She'd never heard her grandmother say such things about herself. Everyone in the family knew about the extraordinary beauty of Grandma's youth. It was evident in family photos. Rose wished she'd inherited more of that from her, too. Oh, she looked like her a little, but not nearly enough to put her in the same category her grandmother had been in. For the first time, Rose began to realize what it must be like for her grandmother, the once great beauty whose looks had long since faded. Now she was just an old and worn-out version of her former self. "You're still beautiful, Grandma," Rose said. And she was, at least to Rose. Grandma laughed. "Child, I haven't been beautiful in a very long time." Rose was ready to champion her grandmother's aging beauty when it hit her. "You're trying to change the subject," she said. Grandma gave her that look, the one she tossed around freely when anyone started stepping on her toes. But Rose didn't care. She had to know more. "So you danced with him. Then what? You go home with him that night?" Grandma's look hardened into a glare. "I'll take that as a yes," Rose giggled. "So you spent 8 days with him. Then what happened? Why'd you leave?" "I had to. I'd just graduated from college. I had a job waiting for me back home. And he had just received orders to Korea." "That was it? You never saw him again?" Grandma shook her head. "No, I never saw him again. We exchanged a few letters, but the gaps between them grew longer, until finally we just stopped writing." "If you loved him so much, why'd you stop writing?" "Sometimes you don't realize what you've got till it's gone," Grandma said in a regretful tone. "Wow, Grandma." Rose sighed and her breath caught in her throat. "That's so sad." It was even sadder that Grandma was here now, 50 years later, to reminisce. Chapter 4. Back in the hotel suite, the memory of Nick Finley swirled in Rosalie's thoughts. She half-filled a short glass with straight whiskey and went out onto the lanai. When Rosalie made the decision to return to Hawaii for the anniversary of her time with Nick, she hadn't intended to tell her children or her grandchildren why she was taking the trip. She should have known Tim Jr., her eldest, would protest her making the voyage alone. But now Rose knew about Nick, and what she'd do with that information was anybody's guess. The one thing Rosalie could count on was that her son would not take the news as well as his daughter had. She eased down into the nearest chair and sipped her drink. A gentle breeze caressed her skin as she began to replay one of her precious memories. Rosalie and Nick walking hand in hand along the beach. She could still see the rocks they'd climbed over to get to a small, secluded inlet. The memory of Nick's kisses shuddered through her. She took another sip of whiskey and closed her eyes. "Grandma?" Rose's voice invaded her thoughts. Rosalie opened her eyes. The sun had begun its descent behind the ocean, casting a fiery hue over the water. Rosalie wanted nothing more than to be alone with her thoughts. She sucked in a breath before glancing over her shoulder. She smiled, but didn't say anything. "You okay?" Rose asked. Rosalie nodded. I'm fine. And she was, or she would be, just as soon as her thoughts could sink back into a time that had long since passed her by. You want to go down to the tidal wave on the 12th floor and watch the fireworks? We could get a couple of Mai Tais, live it up. Rose shrugged. What do you say? I think I'll hang out here, Rosalie said. But you go. I don't want to leave you alone. I insist. Rosalie turned back to face the ocean. I'll be perfectly content sitting right here on this balcony. Alone. Grandma. Rose's hands were on Rosalie's shoulders now. Good Lord, what didn't the girl understand about I want to be alone? Rose said in a sympathetic tone, Have you thought about trying to find him? A second or two passed before Rosalie glanced back over her shoulder. Yes, I have. She shrugged. But I'm afraid of what I'll find. What if he was married? Or, God forbid, dead? Rosalie didn't want to know in either case. Nicholas Finley followed his grandfather into the hallway from their 14th floor suite. Nicholas was surprised that he'd been able to talk his grandfather into going down to the lounge on the 12th floor for the fireworks show. All his grandfather had wanted to do since arriving on the island was sit out there on that damned balcony and stare at the ocean. Nicholas knew it involved a woman, but he didn't know much else. He could guess that his grandfather had known her prior to meeting his grandmother. And now that his grandmother had passed on, his grandfather was left with nothing but his memories. It hadn't sat too well with Nicholas that those memories were of a woman other than his grandmother. But his grandfather was determined. And when grandfather got like this, he didn't much care what anyone else thought. Even though he'd tried not to be, Nicholas was mildly curious about the long-ago memory that had dragged his grandfather back here. When they arrived at the tidal wave, they were greeted by Marla Taylor, a member of the staff. Good evening, gentlemen. You've come to watch the fireworks? She smiled. They nodded. I've got just the seating for you. She beckoned them to follow and led them toward the deck railing to a couple of chairs and a 2-seater couch encircling a coffee table with a reserved sign on it. This section will provide you with a view you aren't likely to forget. Nicholas took a seat on the couch, and his grandfather claimed the nearest chair. They both looked up and thanked Marla. I'll have Beth come over and get you something to drink, she said. That'd be great. Thanks, Grandfather said. As they sat there, the lounge slowly filled up. By the time they'd each had a couple of beers, it was quite crowded. Marla approached them with a young woman about Nicholas's age. She was a pretty girl with long legs, shoulder-length reddish blonde hair, and big brown eyes. You gentlemen won't mind if Rose sits with you? Marla posed it as a question, but clearly it wasn't meant as such, because she was already guiding the girl onto the couch as she spoke. We'd love the company, right, Nicholas? Grandfather said, appearing very eager for this stranger to sit down with them. Nicholas looked at her. It's our pleasure, he said. Can we get you something to drink? Sure, she said. Maybe I'll have a Blue Hawaii. Nicholas didn't miss the reaction on his grandfather's face. He'd caught it quickly, squashing it, but for a split second, Grandfather had been caught off guard by her choice of drink. After Nicholas flagged down the waitress and ordered another round, he turned to Rose. "Will your companion be joining us? I can't imagine that you're here in Hawaii alone." Rose shook her head. "No, no one will be joining us. And no, I'm not here alone. I'm with my grandmother." She glanced at Nicholas's grandfather, then looked back at him. "She's upstairs. I think she's suffering from a bit of jet lag." Nicholas said, "Well, I hope she recovers quickly so she can enjoy the island." "Thanks. I'm sure she will." "Rose, was it?" he asked. She nodded, and he said, "My name is Nicholas Finley, and this is my grandfather. Everybody calls him Nick." Her mouth fell open a little as she glanced at his grandfather. She seemed to be studying him intently. When she looked back at Nicholas, she appeared to give him a quick appraisal too. "Yeah," she nodded. "My name is Rose. Rose Fairbanks." She looked at Nick, then back at Nicholas. "This your first time in Hawaii?" "Mine," Nicholas said, then dipped his head toward his grandfather. "He's been here before. He was stationed here about 100 years ago, when he was in the Air Force." A gleam lit her eyes as she said, "My first trip, too. My grandma's been here before." She smiled. "About 100 years ago." They both laughed. The first of the fireworks shot into the air and exploded in a bright red frenzy. Nicholas scooted closer to Rose. Chapter 5. Nick decided to leave the nightlife to the youngsters, excusing himself when Rose went to the ladies' room. She reminded him a little of Rosalie. She had the same brown eyes and reddish blonde hair. Or maybe it was wishful thinking. He headed upstairs, where he hoped he could still get a decent view of the fireworks from the balcony. He'd much rather watch them in solitude so he could let his thoughts take him to where he really wanted to go. A place he could not get to from here. Yet, this was as close as he was ever going to get. He strolled into the suite, peeked in the fridge, and grabbed a beer from the 6-pack Nicholas had put in there earlier. He closed the fridge and headed for the balcony. Nick lowered himself into a chair. His body, stiffened by age, wasn't as cooperative as it used to be. Getting old was no fun. Nick unscrewed the cap on the beer bottle and tossed it onto the table. These days, he spent a lot of time wishing the past had played out differently and feeling guilty for it. He'd never let that desire take root in his heart when Alma was alive. He was not that much of a cad. Instead, he'd devoted his life to his family while secretly keeping his love for another woman to himself. But Alma was gone now, and Nick didn't see that coming here on the anniversary of meeting Rosalie was doing anything wrong. But he doubted his family would see it that way. He hadn't spoken about the real reason for this trip to Nicholas, although he suspected that Nicholas's suspicions were pretty close to the truth. He just didn't know the particulars. In the end, if Nicholas did learn everything, Nick wasn't sure how he'd take it. As far as Nick knew, Nicholas had his choice of many women, but wasn't serious about any of them. Soft music filtered into Nick's thoughts. He zeroed in on it, trying to determine where it was coming from. Next door? Above him, maybe. What was that song? It was an old one. When he heard Frankie Valli croon a familiar line from the song, "Can't Take My Eyes Off of You," it brought a smile to his face. He and Rosalie had danced to that song the night they met. How he longed to dance with her again. Rose had been gone for nearly 2 hours, and Rosalie had not moved from the lanai except to answer room service's call. She'd ordered blue Hawaiis twice. Sipping her second cocktail, she stared down at the beach, which was illuminated by street lamps along the sidewalk. There was just enough light to see the waves rolling in and out. The sound drifted up to her, bringing with it old, yet precious memories. She rubbed the rim of the glass over her bottom lip, remembering Nick's searing kisses. The memory was so clear in her mind that she could almost feel the sand beneath her as he towered above her. She closed her eyes and let the memory consume her. "Grandma!" Rose's unwelcome voice invaded her thoughts. Rosalie glanced up just as Rose dropped into a nearby chair. Rose asked, "What is Nick's last name?" The girl was bubbling over with excitement. Rosalie could only stare at her. "Is his last name Finley?" Rosalie's heart banged against her chest. How could Rose know that? Rosalie tried to think. Had she mentioned his last name earlier? She couldn't remember. "Did I tell you that today at lunch?" "Oh my God, it is!" Rose practically bounced up and down in her chair. "Grandma, you're not gonna believe it." She reached out to touch Rosalie's arm. "He's here." "What?" Rosalie's soft tone did not project the turmoil escalating inside her. "Nick Finley is here." "That can't possibly be." "Why not?" "Why would he be here?" "For the same reason you are." Rose leaned back in her chair, wearing an "I'm so clever" facade. Rosalie dared to consider for just a second that it might be true. That Nick was here. Her Nick. That he hadn't forgotten her, even after all these years. All these years. Rosalie didn't need to look in the mirror to know that the girl Nick had loved was long gone. She'd succumbed long ago to the consequences of time. "Let's go downstairs, Grandma." Rose stood up and tugged at Rosalie's arm. "He's going to be so surprised." Rosalie shook her head. "No." She stared at Rose. "I can't." "Why not?" Rose stomped her foot. "You came all this way to reminisce about this man, to mourn the one that got away. He's right downstairs, just waiting for you to walk through the door." "You can't possibly know that," Rosalie said. "For all you know, he could be here with his wife." The very thought of it stabbed at her heart. "He's not here with his wife," Rose said. "She's dead. He's here with his grandson, who is insanely handsome, I might add." The young girl Rosalie had once been struggled to break free and run to the 12th floor. But the elderly woman she was now couldn't bring herself to move. If it was true, if Nick really was here, then he was here to remember a girl he'd once known. Rosalie couldn't bring herself to spoil it for him. Rosalie glanced up at Rose. "How does he look?" she asked softly. Rose smiled and returned to her chair. "He's a little gray around the edges, but all in all, I can see what you saw in him." She latched on to Rosalie's hand. "Come on, Grandma, let's go see him." "I can't," Rosalie said calmly. He knew me when I was young, vibrant, and beautiful. She shook her head. I am none of those things now. I don't want to disappoint him. Grandma, he won't be disappointed. He'll be thrilled to find you here, and for the very same reason that he's here. She shrugged. It's fate. Fate? Well, she's a little late. Rosalie laughed at the irony of it. You didn't tell him who you are, did you? No. Good. Rosalie glanced back at the ocean. I came here to reminisce. I'm not ready to have my past come back to haunt me just yet. Marla Taylor sat at the end of the bar, looking at Nicholas Finley sitting alone, and wondered where she'd gone wrong. She hadn't a clue where his grandfather had gone, but it didn't look like he was coming back. And where had Rose gone off to? And why hadn't Rosalie come down with her? This wasn't working out the way she'd planned it. What are you studying so intently? Amanda Wainwright Good, her daughter-in-law's sister, propped her arm on the bar next to Marla. I think I'm losing my touch, she said. That can't be so. Amanda shook her head. Sad but true. Marla sucked in a breath. And I was so sure about them. Them? Amanda scanned the area. A couple of the guests. Amanda shrugged. If it's meant to be. Yeah. She droned the words out. Donnie tells me that all the time. She dismissed her son's aphorism with a quick wave. If I listened to him, you and your sister wouldn't be here right now. Okay, so you've got a point, Amanda said. So what's the problem? They don't seem to like each other? I'm afraid it's worse than that. I can't seem to get them in the same room at the same time so they can meet. Amanda grinned. Well, they'd have to meet if they had comp tickets at the same table on the Glamorous Genie tomorrow night, wouldn't they? Reluctantly, Rose went back downstairs by herself. She'd been gone a while. She'd used the restroom as an excuse to sneak upstairs to check on her grandmother. She hoped Nicholas hadn't given up on her and left. Happily, she found him sitting right where she'd left him. This time, he was alone. She coached herself not to get too excited. His grandfather had probably gone to the restroom or something. Hey, she smiled, sliding up next to him on the sofa. Sorry I took so long. I thought you ditched me. Not in a million years, she said, reaching for the fresh cocktail he'd ordered for her. I tried to get my grandma to come down, but she wouldn't. I'm sorry to hear that. I'd love to meet her. Where'd Nick go? He took off. I'm trying not to leave him alone, but he's making it awfully hard on me. He chuckled. Well, she shrugged, we can only do what they'll let us. That is so true. Nicholas draped his arm around Rose's shoulders and snuggled her closer. So, Rose, tell me about yourself. Where are you from? California. You? New York. Wow, she said, feeling a little bit depressed. There's a whole country between us. I've always wanted to check out California, he said with a grin. You'd be as welcome as anyone I know, Rose said. Nicholas's smile broadened with approval. Elation flowed through Rose as she reveled in the delightful warmth of his mahogany eyes and his dazzling smile. It filled her with hope. She asked, "You got a girl back in New York?" "If I did, I doubt I do now," he laughed. "Somehow I think that a trip to Hawaii without her would be the proverbial straw, if you know what I mean." "I do," Rose said. "But you didn't answer my question." He looked at her with amused curiosity. "No," he said, "I do not have a girl. How about you?" She chuckled and shook her head. "I don't have a girl either." Rose Fairbanks was beautiful, incredibly charming, and she had one hell of a sense of humor. Nicholas laced his fingers around hers and drew her left hand up to inspect it. No rings on a certain finger, and no sign of any having been there. Nicholas's gaze drifted back up to meet hers. She was simply enchanting. He leaned in, pressing his face into her hair. It smelled like flowers of some sort. Roses, maybe. Fitting. The intoxication swam inside his head. "Would you like to go for a walk on the beach?" She nodded and turned to him. "Yeah," she said, her lips brushing against his cheek. Nicholas stood and offered his hand. She took it and let him pull her to her feet. Hand in hand, they headed for the elevator. Chapter 6. Rosalie wrapped the shawl around her shoulders and picked up her handbag. "Grandma," Rose said, "are you sure you don't want to see Nick?" She followed Rosalie out into the hallway, closing the door to their suite behind her. "We could forgo the dinner cruise if you want. I could give Nicholas a call." Rosalie stopped and turned to face Rose. "You should have invited Nicholas to join you tonight." It made no difference to Rosalie. She'd be just as content staying in, or maybe taking a walk on the beach. She was not here to see Nick. She was here to remember a time that had long since passed her by. She had no desire to let Nick see what an old woman, the once beautiful girl he'd fallen in love with, had become. "No, Grandma." Rose grabbed her hand. "We are going on the dinner cruise," she said, pulling her along. Did they have dinner cruises back then? "Yes." Rosalie shot her an ironic glance. "Contrary to popular belief, boats had been around for a long time before I was born." "That's not what I meant. I was wondering if you and Nick went on one." "Those things are and always have been expensive." Rosalie shook her head. "Nick was in the Air Force. There wasn't much money in that line of work." They stepped into an elevator that was already occupied by two other couples. Everyone stayed silent while the lift journeyed to the lobby. "So," Rose said, wrapping her arm around Rosalie's as they headed for the exit. "If funds were limited, what did you and Nick do?" "We ate in cafes and coffee shops, took walks along the beach." Rosalie wasn't going to tell her more than that. Certainly not what they did along the deserted perimeter of the shoreline, beyond the large boulders that still guarded the clandestine alcove. Outside, a young girl, Sophia according to her Sapphire Bay name tag, approached them. "Glamorous Genie dinner cruise?" "Yes." Rose showed her the tickets Marla had given her that morning. "Ah, VIP. Let me get your car." Sophia raised her hand in the air. "Is it far?" Rose asked. "No." Sophia shook her head. "It's about a half a mile to the marina. You can see the ship from here," she said, pointing toward a small 4-deck cruise ship off in the distance. "Oh, cool. It looks like a real cruise ship." A black sedan pulled up beside them. Sophia opened the door. "I'm sure you'll enjoy it." Once Rosalie and Rose were inside, the girls shut the car door and the driver sped away. "I thought they shuttled you to these things on tour buses," Rose said, glancing at Rosalie. The driver spoke up. "Not the personal guests of the Taylors." "The Taylors?" Rose asked. "The resort's owners." Rose looked at Rosalie. Her eyes grew wide and her mouth dropped open. Rosalie suspected hers did the same. Rose whispered, "Marla owns the hotel?" Rosalie never would have guessed it. "It would seem so." "Wow," Rose muttered. "I'm glad we were nice to her." Rosalie cut her eyes at Rose. "This is why I tell you to be nice to strangers. You never know who you're dealing with." "You said it, Grandma," Rose chuckled. "I still wish you'd change your mind." Rosalie didn't need further explanation. She knew what, or better yet, who, Rose was talking about. "I don't expect you to understand this, but I want to keep Nick's memories of me intact. I don't want to spoil it for him." She paused, suppressing a sigh. "Reality would be a slap in the face. The girl he's reminiscing about is now an old, old woman." "You think he doesn't know that?" "I know he knows it." Rosalie was growing a bit frustrated. Tangling with Rose was like tangling with her younger self. But knowing it and seeing it are two entirely different things. "But Grandma, doesn't it mean anything to you that he's here for the same reason you are? He's here to remember the time he spent with you." "All the more reason to leave his memories alone," Rosalie said as the car pulled through a roped-off area alongside the ship. "If you go home without seeing him, you're gonna regret it." Maybe. Probably. But that was better than disappointing him. A Polynesian attendant opened the car door and helped Rosalie out first, then Rose. "Good evening, ladies," he said with a broad smile. "Good evening," Rosalie said. Rose offered him the tickets. He slipped them from her hand and led them aboard the ship. Rosalie could tell this was not the usual entrance the patrons entered through. It was far too desolate. They took an elevator up, and when the doors opened, the chatter let her know they'd found the other diners. Another Polynesian man, he looked like he couldn't be much more than 21, stepped up to them. Their escort handed the waiter their tickets. He glanced at them, then smiled. "Captain's table. Right this way." "Captain's table?" Rose mouthed the words as she looked at Rosalie. Rosalie peered at Rose and shook her head. She had never liked being embarrassed in public, and showing people that one did not know how to conduct oneself was, well, embarrassing. Thankfully, Rose piped down as they followed the waiter through the maze of tables. He was a big, robust fellow, which made it hard to see where they were headed. Only after they'd passed the tables could Rosalie get a look at the diners seated around them. Everyone looked happy, filled with excitement. Rosalie wished that she and Nick could have taken one of these cruises back in the day. Nick. The thought of him blew across her mind with a sigh. He was here, on this island, and in the very hotel at which she was staying. She wished she had gone down to the tidal wave last night, long enough to get a glimpse of him. Rosalie was sure she wouldn't have been disappointed. She was more worried about his reaction to her. She'd long since lost her looks, the thing about her that had caught his eye in the first place. Her hair was no longer strawberry blonde. Now it was visibly gray. And not the kind of gray that looked like a towhead blonde, either. Nope, there was no denying it. Rosalie's hair was definitely gray. She'd stopped dyeing it years ago. Tim hadn't seemed to mind, and she was happy to be rid of the hassle. Their escort stopped and finally moved aside. "Here we are," he said. His movements drew her attention to the large round table that had about 10 chairs around it. Most were empty. 2 men sat on the opposite side from where Rosalie and Rose stood. One was older, the other young. It took a second for Rosalie to overcome the odd feeling of familiarity inundating her about both of them. The younger one could have been Nick, or at the very least his brother, if 50 years hadn't passed. A heavy feeling slipped down into her gut. Her eyes drifted to the older man and settled there for a long, hard look. Her heart damn near stopped. Rosalie reached for the nearest chair to steady herself. Run. The single word barged through her thoughts. Run before he has the chance to get a good look at you. Run before you're faced with his disappointment when he realizes what's happened to his beloved Rosalie. She let go of the chair and reached for Rose's arm before her granddaughter had the chance to draw Nick's attention to them. He was laughing about something his grandson had said. Then, his gaze drifted up to her. Rosalie's breath caught in her throat. The shock that his face first displayed was overrun by a smile as he got up from his chair. Rosalie's feet were frozen in place as Nick moved around the table. She wanted to run, but she couldn't. It was just like the night they met. She'd looked into his eyes and gotten caught there. The same thing was happening now. He stopped in front of her. "Rosalie?" His questioning gaze searched her face for confirmation. She nodded. He reached out, touching her cheek with his fingertips. "It's been a very long time." Rosalie shrugged. 50 years. To her surprise, Nick pulled her to him. "I thought I'd never see you again." Rosalie closed her eyes, reveling in his embrace. If she tried real hard, maybe she could wish away the years and they'd be young once again, with all their dreams still intact. Back before time got away from them and robbed them of a future together. Stop that. No matter how much Rosalie loved Nick, had always loved him, she couldn't wish away her own children or Rose and her other grandchildren. But she wouldn't wish away her love for Nick either. Fate had played a cruel, cruel joke on Rosalie. Nick held Rosalie at arm's length for a moment, just gazing at her. If the smile he wore was any indication, he was not disappointed. Not in the least. She felt a glimmer of hope. Nick led Rosalie around the table, keeping his arm draped around her waist. He pushed his grandson over 2 chairs and invited Rosalie to sit. Nick's grandson remained standing while Rosalie and Rose claimed the chairs between them. Nick's glance danced between Rose and Rosalie. "Rose is your granddaughter?" he asked. "We met her last night. I thought she looked familiar." He blessed Rosalie with a dimpled smile. "I should have known. She looks like you." The next morning, Rose and her grandmother had breakfast with Nicholas and his grandfather. Afterward, Nick asked Rosalie to go for a walk along the beach, for old time's sake. She agreed. Rose and Nicholas stayed behind, watching from lounge chairs poolside, while Rosalie and Nick followed the sidewalk winding along the shoreline. "Does this feel weird to you?" Nicholas glanced at Rose. "Or is it just me?" Rose shook her head. "It's not just you." "Do you realize that our grandparents have been carrying a torch for each other for 50 years? Kind of unbelievable, isn't it? How are we supposed to feel about this?" A faint thread of bitterness emerged in his voice. "I'm not sure I can be the supportive grandson my grandfather expects me to be." Well, she was suddenly anxious to defend her grandmother. "I don't know about your family, but my grandma loved my grandpa." Rose's confidence in her words spiraled upward. "Sure, she's obviously been carrying your grandpa in her heart all these years, but she never once made my grandpa feel like he was second best. He loved her, and he knew she loved him." Rose stopped for a minute in hopes of warding off the tears that were determined to make an appearance any time she talked about her grandfather. "My grandpa's gone, though. Just like your grandma. So why shouldn't our grandparents have their chance now?" "Well," sympathy softened Nicholas's tone. "When you put it that way." Besides, Rose reached for his hand. "I'm not opposed to seeing more of you back on the mainland." That's a definite vote in favor of them getting together. They laughed, and Rose thought Nicholas might be coming to terms with the situation. She totally got where he was coming from. It had been a little weird for her at first, too. But after meeting Nicholas, she'd put her own feelings aside to look at reality from its true perspective. She couldn't help but wonder where she'd be in 50 years. Would she still be thinking about him? "Good morning." Marla's voice interrupted Rose's thoughts. She glanced up at Marla, who said, "I trust you all had a good time on the Glamorous Genie last night." "We did," Rose nodded. "And your respective grandparents? How are they this morning?" "Fine," Rose said. "They've gone for a walk on the beach," Nicholas said. "Wonderful." Marla beamed. Rose suspected she was taking credit for Nick and Rosalie's morning stroll. It was easy enough to guess that Marla had been playing matchmaker when she arranged for the 4 of them to dine together on the dinner cruise. What Marla didn't know was that Nick and Rosalie already knew each other. Chapter 7. Rosalie and Nick weren't able to walk nearly as far as they used to. They hadn't even made it to the boulders they'd climbed over so long ago before Nick retrieved a handkerchief from his pocket to swab his forehead. "I think perhaps we should head back." She said it so he didn't have to. "I'm afraid I'm not as young as I used to be," she added with a slight chuckle. He patted the hand she had draped over the fold of his elbow. You haven't changed a bit. That is an exaggeration at best, she said. But I appreciate you saying it. Rosalie, I've spent my entire life missing you. I don't want to do that anymore. We had our chance, Nick. Rosalie sucked in a breath to squelch the feeling that she'd been cheated by fate. It just wasn't meant to be. Better late than never, though, right? If there was only you and me to think about. Rosalie felt like she was losing Nick all over again. I'd do what I didn't do 50 years ago. What's that? I'd ask you to take me with you. It's not too late for that. Rosalie gave a choked, desperate laugh, then said, Nick. She paused long enough to look at him. Not only has too much water flowed under the bridge. As she spoke, a glazed look of despair began to spread over Nick's face. She continued anyway. But the creeks run dry. I don't believe that, he said with quiet determination. Rosalie stopped walking and Nick did too. She pulled away from his arm and reached for his hands. Fate was against us 50 years ago, and fate is against us now. Nick gave her hands a gentle squeeze. I've loved you for 50 years, Rosalie. He shrugged and shook his head. I can't walk away a second time. They began walking again. First her, then him. Nick did not let go of her hand. Rosalie let her gaze drift out toward the ocean. And I've loved you for 50 years. She sucked in a breath to muster up the courage to look back at him again. Knowing that, do you think either of our families are going to accept us? I don't care what my children and grandchildren think. He seemed so sure of himself and showed no signs of relenting. I've given my entire life to my family. Now that I've found you again, I want to give what's left of it to you. I won't come between you and your children, Nick. Rosalie glanced up to see Rose and Nicholas in lounge chairs near the pool, mere feet from them. She'd been so wrapped up in Nick and trying to resist him that she hadn't realized they were back at the hotel. She pulled her hand free of Nick's and said to his grandson, Nicholas, thank you for indulging an old woman. Mrs. Fairbanks, it was my pleasure, he said. I'm all for anything that makes my grandfather smile. Thank you. Rosalie knew she had to break away from Nick, to let him go. But walking away was hard. She said to Nicholas, You're very kind. Rosalie moved toward the steps and shot a glance at Rose. You okay, Grandma? She asked. Rosalie nodded. With a sigh, she said, Yes, I'll be fine. I think I need to rest for a bit. Rosalie? Nick's voice wrapped around her. She glanced over her shoulder. He said, Have lunch with me? She smiled, unable to resist. I'd like that. She let her gaze linger on Nick for a few seconds before she turned and headed inside. Rose caught up with her. Grandma, what's going on?
Nothing.
What gives? She asked. Either you're upset or you're not feeling well.
I'm fine.
Rosalie said.
I just didn't know it was going to be this hard.
She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead. She was on the verge of tears, and she didn't want to be. What's so hard? Rose touched her arm, stopping her at the elevators. What happened out there? She looked at Rose.
He said he's loved me for 50 years, and he can't walk away from me again.
Grandma, that's wonderful! Rosalie shook her head.
No, dear. That's not wonderful. It's tragic.
Why? Rose asked.
Your father and your aunt will never accept it, any more than Nick's children would.
Screw Daddy! Screw Aunt Caroline! Rose belted out. And screw Nick's kids!
Rose.
Rosalie chastised her, just above a whisper. Oh, come on, Grandma! Rose stood her ground. You've devoted practically your whole life to Daddy and Aunt Caroline. It's time you did something for yourself.
Sweetheart, I can't come between Nick and his children.
The elevator doors opened. Rosalie stepped inside. Rose followed her. Rosalie latched onto the railing. She was too old for this. Standing in front of the Beachcomber Cafe, Rosalie checked her watch. 12:45. Nick was supposed to meet her at 12:30. It wasn't like him to be late. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Yes, that must be it. He'd probably come to his senses, realizing what a catastrophe it would be for the two of them to pick up where they left off 50 years ago. But that didn't change the fact that Rosalie had been looking forward to having lunch with him. It hurt to think he'd decided not to show up. She checked her watch again. 12:46. She sighed. She'd give him 10 more minutes. She sat down on the bench just outside the restaurant's entrance and scanned the lobby, hoping to see him coming. She was disappointed. Another scan of the lobby. It was Rose, not Nick, she saw barreling toward her. Rose dropped down onto the bench beside Rosalie. Oh, Grandma, she said frantically. Nicholas called. Nick has been taken to the hospital. Nicholas thinks he's had a heart attack. Rosalie's heart fell to the floor. Oh, God. If Nick died before she could talk to him, she'd never forgive herself. I need to go to him. Marla's getting us a car, Rose said. Oh, good. Rosalie urged her tired old heart to calm down. She looked at her granddaughter.
Does she know it's an emergency?
Yes, Grandma, Rose said gently. She knows. Honolulu traffic was maddening, Rose thought as she studied her grandmother's weary face while the car was at practically a standstill on the H1. Rose's phone dinged. She scanned the brief message from Nicholas. He's unresponsive. We're in room 214. Rose responded with a simple, We're on our way. She glanced around. Their only hope was to get off the freeway. Driver, she called out. He glanced in the rearview mirror. Is there an alternate route we can take? The driver nodded.
We're getting off at the next exit.
How far is that? Without a word, the driver whipped onto the shoulder of the road and cruised up to the off-ramp. At least on the city streets, they were moving at a faster pace. but it still seemed like it took forever to get to the hospital. When they finally rolled up to the entrance, Rose turned to her grandmother. Rosalie was clutching her arms to her chest. When Rose told her that Nick had had a heart attack, the color had faded from her face. It hadn't returned. "Grandma?" Rose asked. "You ready?" Rosalie's quiet response was a simple nod. Rose helped her grandmother out of the car and escorted her inside. They found the elevator with relative ease and took it up to the second floor. Outside the door at room 214, they paused. Rosalie placed her hand on the door and held it there for a time before pushing it open. Rose followed her inside. Nicholas was sitting somberly at his grandfather's bedside. Nick lay quietly in the bed. He looked like he was sleeping. Rose remembered Nicholas's text that Nick was unresponsive. She placed her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Nicholas?" He looked up. When his eyes met hers, he smiled. Then he was on his feet, hugging her. He said, "I'm glad you're here." "How is he?" she asked. "They're running some tests. We'll know more when the results come back." Nicholas backed away from Rose but clung to her hand. His gaze drifted to her grandmother. "Mrs. Fairbanks?" He looked at Rosalie with pleading eyes. "Will you talk to him? He'll listen if you tell him to hang on." Rosalie nodded. "Yes, I'll talk to him," she said. "But I think you give me too much credit." "He loves you." Nicholas's declaration made her grandmother's jaw drop slightly. "He'll listen." Nicholas gave Rosalie a gentle smile, then looked at Rose. "Would you walk with me to get a cup of coffee?" Rose nodded and squeezed his hand. As he tugged her toward the door, Rose glanced over her shoulder. "Grandma, we'll be right back. Can we bring you anything?" "No, I'm fine," she said, without moving or looking back at Rose. Part of Rose didn't want to leave her grandmother alone. The other part wanted to go with Nicholas, to comfort him. "Go get your coffee," her grandmother said, still staring straight ahead. "I need to talk to Nick." "All right." Rose's voice shredded the words. She followed Nicholas into the hallway where they walked in silence toward the cafeteria. Every once in a while, he squeezed her hand. She took it as his way of thanking her for being there with him. He needed someone to lean on. She would be that person, and she'd do it quietly. The last thing Nicholas needed was to have to engage in chit-chat right now. They got their coffees. His was black with 2 sugars. She'd ordered a non-fat latte. They went to a table near the windows and proceeded to sit in silence. The silence didn't bother her so much as his avoiding eye contact with her. She wished he would look at her. She wanted to offer him a reassuring glance. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't think of anything that sounded reassuring without making promises she knew she couldn't keep. Nick's recovery wasn't up to her. She wanted to offer Nicholas comfort, but comfort came from friends and family. She was neither. "Nicholas," she said softly, "is there someone I can call for you?" He glanced up to meet her gaze. His tense face melted with a gentle smile. "Thank you. I've called my dad." Nicholas let out a humorless laugh. "When he gets here, he's not going to be happy with me." Why? Rose asked. It's not like it's your fault. Nicholas tightened his mouth and blew a breath out through his nose. He studied Rose's face for a moment as if he were searching for comfort. I'm afraid it is my fault. How so? I wasn't happy when I found out why we're really here. He didn't have to say it. Rose could guess. Her grandmother. He continued. And the reason we're here, showing up in the flesh, didn't help matters either. Nicholas shook his head. I was hard on him. It felt like a betrayal of my grandmother. I know what you mean, Rose said. I've had a little more time to get used to it. She sucked in a breath and assessed the magnitude of their grandparents' affair from so long ago. My grandmother has loved a man who is not my grandfather for the whole of her adult life. She shrugged. But you can't help who you love, right? That was the heart of the matter. Rose was beginning to realize that her grandmother was responsible only for how she conducted herself. All I know is that my grandmother devoted her whole life to my grandfather and their children, and ultimately me, my brother, and my cousins. Rose looked at Nicholas. He was incredibly handsome. She felt like they had a connection. But pretty soon, they'd be going their separate ways, just like their grandparents had done. My grandma didn't do anything wrong, Rose said in a contentious tone. She simply came here to remember someone who's lived in her heart all these years. Rose's heart ached for her grandmother, who she was seeing much more clearly now. When you put it that way, it's very sad. Nicholas swabbed his hands over his face. I shouldn't have been so hard on him. Nicholas. Rose reached across the table to touch his arm. I'm sure it was simply bad timing on your part and nothing more. I seriously doubt that it caused your grandfather's heart attack. You're very kind. He smiled. That smile of Nicholas's and the way he looked at her made her heart swoon. But her mind was filled with the uncertainty of Nick's health. What do the doctors say? She asked. Is he going to be all right? Nicholas nodded. They said it was a mild heart attack. If he wakes up soon, he should make a full recovery. He looked at her and grinned. I appreciate your concern, and for a man you barely know. Well, while I do hope the best for your grandfather, I'll confess, I'm more worried about my grandmother. A gentle melancholy took possession of Rose. My grandfather's death was hard enough for her. I can't imagine what it would do to her if something happened to Nick, here in the place where they fell in love. Nicholas was silent for a moment. His expression grew even more lost and forlorn. I can't imagine what it was like. He glanced at Rose, then shrugged. For either one of them. Me either, she said. But what little understanding I can grasp from it, I wouldn't wish it on anyone. All those years, gone. She shook her head. Time had eluded Rosalie and Nick, and they happened to stumble upon each other again, 50 years later. Rose looked at Nicholas. Aren't they due? After Rose and Nicholas left, Rosalie had pulled the chair he'd been sitting in closer to the bed. For the last 15 minutes or so, She'd been sitting there with her elbows on the edge of the bed, just staring at Nick. Like her, he was an ancient version of his former self. She wished she could have witnessed the transformation as it came upon him gradually. But someone else had had that pleasure. Finding out that she'd been in Nick's heart all these years had offered her a measure of comfort. Rosalie had thought that would be enough. But the sight of him lying in the hospital bed hacked at her bruised and battered heart. Rosalie said softly, "I am a foolish, foolish woman." She touched his hand gently. "Nick, open your eyes for me." Silence. Rosalie took his hand and laced her fingers with his. She brought his hand to her cheek and rested it there. "There are so many things I need to say to you." Her voice cracked as she tried to hold back the urge to cry. "Please wake up." Her tears broke free and slid down to where Nick's hand rested against her cheek. "Please, Nick," she whispered. "Wake up." Rosalie lowered her head and closed her eyes. She'd loved him in secret for so long that she wasn't sure she knew how to love him out in the open. But it couldn't end like this. Why had fate brought them back together if she was just going to yank him away from Rosalie again? What if she'd been looking at this all wrong? When Rosalie had first discovered that Nick was in Hawaii too, she'd thought fate was back for another round of that same old spiteful joke. But what if that wasn't the case? What if fate was trying to make up for it by giving her a second chance? Should she have been so quick to throw that away? Whatever time she and Nick had left on this earth, didn't she want to spend it with him? The sound of Nick's heavy breathing dragged her attention back to his face. He was wincing, but his eyes were still closed. He licked his lips and moaned. "Nick," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open. "Rosalie?" "Thank God." She sucked in a breath and closed her eyes, keeping his hand against her cheek. "Don't cry." He reached for her face with his other hand and wiped her tears away. "I was afraid you were going to die," she said, between tear-choked breaths. "Before I got the chance to tell you how much I love you, how much I've always loved you." "Can you say that and then turn around and walk out of my life?" he asked. "Because if you can, your words don't really mean much." The next morning, Nicholas stepped inside his grandfather's hospital room. Rosalie had been there all night. She looked tired and worried. He glanced at the bed. His grandfather was sleeping. Quietly, he dragged a chair up to Rosalie's side and sat down. "How's he doing?" he asked. "Much better this morning, I think," she said. "Where's Rose?" "She's gone down for coffee." Ah. Nicholas tried to tamp down the joy over hearing that Rose was nearby. "I'm sure you could catch up with her," Rosalie suggested. "She'll be back, right?" Rosalie chuckled. "That she will." "When do you return to the mainland?" She said, "When Nick is able to leave." Rosalie's declaration surprised Nicholas, although it shouldn't have. It was a given that she wouldn't leave while his grandfather was still in the hospital. But hearing her say it was still overwhelming.
Nicky.
Grandfather murmured. Nicholas hated it when he called him that.
I'm glad you're here,
He said, his voice strengthening.
We need to talk.
Rosalie pushed herself up.
I think I'll go stretch my legs. Maybe I can catch up with Rose.
She started toward the door.
Rosalie,
Grandfather called after her.
don't be gone too long.
She smiled.
I'll be back in a jiff.
After she disappeared into the hallway, Nicholas returned his full attention to his grandfather.
How are you feeling?
He asked. You look much better today.
I'm fine,
Grandfather said dismissively.
I want you to know I've asked Rosalie to marry me.
And she said yes. Grandfather finally smiled, and his eyes filled with hope. Relief reigned heavily over Nicholas. Grandfather had something to live for now. Nicholas said,
She didn't have to leave for you to tell me that.
No,
but it's better that this conversation is between you and me.
Oh? Nicholas started to feel the need to be on guard.
I see the way you look at Rose.
Nicholas shrugged.
Don't be daft, boy.
Don't get excited, Grandfather. Urgency filled Nicholas's tone. Stay calm, okay?
I loved your grandmother very much.
Nick's voice was low, but full of intensity.
I'm very proud of my family, and I don't want you to ever doubt that. So don't take this the wrong way.
There was a crushing loneliness in Grandfather's tone, as if he were overcome with sadness.
I don't want you to end up like me.
Nicholas had a pretty good idea where this conversation was headed, and he didn't want to go there, so he feigned ignorance. How's that?
Loving a woman who's not your wife.
Did you hit your head? He asked. I'm not married.
Don't be a smartass.
Come on, I barely know her. With a hint of laughter, Nicholas tried to play it off like it was no big deal. But they both knew better.
That's the same thing I thought when I let Rosalie walk out of my life 50 years ago.
Epilogue. 6 months later, Sapphire Bay Resort. Nick guided Rosalie around the dance floor of the resort's party terrace.
Well, Mrs. Finley.
He grinned as he called her that.
I told you they'd get married within 6 months of our wedding.
He nodded toward the other side of the dance floor, where Nicholas and Rose were dancing in the kind of embrace one expected from newlyweds. Rosalie couldn't help but smile as she looked at the bride and groom. Her granddaughter looked lovely in Rosalie's old wedding gown. She'd tried to get Rose to go for something more contemporary, but the headstrong girl wouldn't hear of it. She was determined to get married in the same gown that Rosalie had worn when she married Rose's grandfather. Nicholas had been very supportive of the idea. It was no wonder Rose had fallen helplessly and hopelessly in love with him, just the way Rosalie had done with Nick all those years ago. Rosalie was glad that fate had not been quite so cruel to Nicholas and Rose, though. But Rosalie couldn't complain. Here she was, dancing with her husband and the love of her life at the wedding of their respective grandchildren. With any luck, she and Nick would one day share a great-grandchild or two. Rosalie and Nick had met once, long ago, and fallen endlessly in love. Then fate had forced them to go their separate ways, and they'd spent a lifetime with other people. But 50 years later, the love they'd felt for each other had brought them back to the place where they'd shared a magical moment, proving it's never too late for love. This has been A Romance to Remember, Sapphire Bay Romance, Book 4, written by Sandra Edwards, narrated by Heather Masters. Copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards. Production copyright 2015 by Sandra Edwards.